Hello friends, this is Vision Overseas. We are providing both online and offline coaching with most repeated and authentic practice material. Once you join our coaching, you will be updated with latest practice material for next quarter. If you have any question or query, you can visit our website thevisionoverseas.com, and even you can contact us on given WhatsApp number for more details. Thank you.
Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland in 1835. His family moved to America when he was 13 and settled in Pittsburgh. He found jobs working in a fabric mill and telegraph office. Carnegie always did well at whatever he set his mind to. He was known to make improvements to any job he held. While working for the telegraph office, he began studying the railroad system, and he soon became the superintendent. He took the money he had saved and invested in an oil company. His investment return was good, and then he went to England to learn how to make steel. He wanted to make steel that was cheaper and more durable than American steel. He came back with his knowledge and built a huge steel factory. Carnegie's factory was very successful and he sold it for $480 million. Carnegie was a very wealthy man, but he was more interested in philanthropy than spending his money on himself. He spent the rest of his life giving his money away to worthy causes. Reading and learning were very important to him, so he built many libraries. He also established universities and research institutes. Carnegie built hospitals, museums, and theaters. One of the most recognizable buildings he built was Carnegie Hall in New York City. Carnegie Hall hosts many concerts and symphonies each year and is an important part of New York City culture. Andrew Carnegie passed away at the age of 83. In his lifetime he gave away 90% of his fortune. He is known as a man who was selfless and wanted to do good for others. About the importance of tea, one of the three most favorite drinks in England, in which the others are chocolate and coffee. Drinking tea in England was a symbol of social freedom, was very expensive and could only be ordered by men in public. Men had tea in coffee houses, making trades and chatting business, while women could only drink tea in private places or wait for their husbands to bring tea back home. Absolutism is referred to as the claim that there is a universally valid moral system. Such a system applies to everyone, whether they realize it or not. Also, it contains rules, guidelines, and principles, which are all universal. It acts as a roadmap guiding individual and social behaviors. Some principles of absolutism cannot be violated or betrayed, and they have wide acceptance with no assumptions or exceptions. There is a boundary line that tells what is right and what is wrong. The idea of absolutism is that nothing is dependent on situations.
For many developed countries, the 1980s was a time when the switch from traditional heavy industries and manufacturing to services and information-based enterprise was completed. This led to widespread changes in employment patterns in these countries, as well as having profound social effects. In fact, it isn't going too far to say that there was a basic transformation in the whole culture, which can still be observed today.
I think that's not going to be such a viable option for Cerberus, but that may be the way that they're going to approach it. Private equity, of course, is supposed to have the advantage of taking management out of the spotlight of quarterly profits and industry analysts and prying shareholder eyes, and that hypothetically gives them a chance to take slower, more patient routes to doing something to turn a company around. I would hope, and I have some, I guess, optimism that some of the Cerberus team will have some creativity and imagination.
This week we're going to be continuing our discussion of women in society. Last week we looked at a number of issues relating to women in education. If you remember, we discussed women both at school and at university. Today we're going to be considering the roles that women play in the workplace. Again, we'll start by taking a historical perspective, and inevitably you'll find that many of the same events that impacted on women in education also had a major influence on their working lives. In the second half of the lecture, I'll concentrate on the situation in Europe today, and I'll invite you to suggest how you think things are likely to develop over the next decade. Okay, so let us get started.
Consumers will have much more choice. For instance, food products sold in Australia might be manufactured in the USA, China, Finland, and dozens of other countries. At the same time, mergers and takeovers mean that governments are actually losing power to major global corporations. We can probably all think of companies that exert a great deal of influence, which may be good for consumers.
You wake up in the middle of the night in a strange hotel miles away from home, disoriented most probably from jet lag, when even the most expensive surroundings can seem empty and dispiriting. You have paid a great deal of money to stay in this first-class hotel with its contemporary technology, but according to recent research carried out by an international travel and public relations company, all is not well.
I'd recommend that you all try to get hold of English in the Southern Hemisphere by Nolan and Watts, as this provides an excellent overview of the topics that we're going to be covering in this module. It's really our primary text. It has particularly strong sections on the history of English in Australia and New Zealand, examining in some depth how the language has developed in these countries. The sections on phonology and on vocabulary will be invaluable when you're doing the written assignment, which I'm going to be telling you about in a moment once I've given you the details of a couple of other essential references. An important question about education is then, why do some types of students achieve success easily and others struggle to do well? Well, one theory is that there is a genetic reason for academic achievement. What I mean by that is a certain innate, measurable level of intelligence. Another frequently discussed theory is environmental factors, such as the effect of home and family upbringing. A final reason is related to the teaching and learning process within educational institutions and the way it is organized, administered, and assessed. To be honest, the biggest problem for most undergraduate students, in terms of academic writing, is not only adapting to far more structured and formal style, but also learning how to ascertain the difference between important, valid information and unnecessary, or even irrelevant material. In my experience, I would say it takes students their first year, if not longer, to appreciate what is required and to start to implement those requirements in their writing. What they really should be doing, if they are struggling with written assignments, is to seek help from the excellent support services which are available at the university. Before the beginning of the 1900s, the only way to obtain pearls was by collecting very large numbers of pearl oysters from the ocean floor by hand. The oysters, or sometimes mussels, were brought to the surface, opened, and searched. More than a ton of these had to be checked in order to find just 3 or 4 quality pearls. Divers often descended to depths of over 100 feet on just one single breath. Now, of course, this exposed them to hostile creatures and dangerous waves, not to mention drowning. In some areas, divers put grease on their bodies to conserve heat, and they held a large object like a rock to descend so they didn't have to exert effort going down. Today, pearl diving has pretty much been supplanted by cultured pearl. Particles are implanted in the oyster to encourage the formation of pearl farms, and this allows for more predictable production. The divers who still work do so mainly for the tourist industry.
Stars and the material between them are almost always found in gigantic stellar systems called galaxies. Our own galaxy, the Milky Way system, happens to be one of the 2 largest systems in the local group of 24 or so galaxies. The other is the Andromeda Galaxy. It stretches more than 100,000 light-years from one end to the other, and it is located about 2 million light-years distant from us.
When it comes to lizard sex, size does matter, but not in the way you might think. Because in the June 4th online issue of the journal Current Biology, scientists say that for at least one type of lizard, larger eggs are more likely to make girls, while smaller eggs yield boys. For many animals, the sex of an individual is dictated solely by its chromosomes, but for small alpine lizards, gender isn't so cut and dried. The scientists had earlier found that nest temperature can influence the sex of lizard hatchlings. Cooler nests turn out more boys, no matter what their chromosomes say. At the same time, the researchers noticed that larger eggs seemed to make more daughters, but they wanted to put their observation to the test. So they took big eggs and removed some yolk, and voila, they made males. Adding yolk to a little egg was a recipe for a female. This egg size manipulation might allow moms to balance their babies' sexes when a chilly nest would otherwise produce mostly sons, because when it comes to alpine lizards, sex determination all comes down to a practical yolk.
Early farming began in the Near East about 10,500 years ago. Farming first reached the Balkans in Europe some 8 to 9,000 years ago and then crept westward. Locals in Britain, separated from the mainland by the relatively newly formed English Channel, did not start farming until about 6,000 years ago. But an analysis of sediment from a submerged British archaeological site called Boldner Cliff found something unexpected.
Amongst our Boldner Cliff samples, we found ancient DNA evidence of wheat at the site, which was not seen in mainland Britain for another 2,000 years.
That's Robin Allaby of the University of Warwick.
However, wheat was already being grown in southern Europe. This is incredibly exciting because it means Boldner's inhabitants were not as isolated as previously thought. In fact, they were in touch, one way or another, with more advanced Neolithic farming communities in southern Europe.
The work by Allaby and colleagues is in the journal Science. The researchers showed that the wheat remains are genetically more similar to Near Eastern domesticated wheat than to local distant cousins, and they found no evidence of pollen, meaning that the wheat was almost certainly imported. In an accompanying perspectives piece in the journal, archaeologist Gregor Larson of Durham University writes that the findings show that DNA analysis can help scientists tease out details about the historical movement of plants and animal species.
Lions roaming the savannah are a staple of nature documentaries, but the millions of little lions that live in our homes and neighborhoods also lead fascinating lives. We know more about those lives now because a 2-year-long study used radio transmitters to track cats at the southern edge of the cities of Champaign and Urbana in Illinois. It would have taken a dozen field researchers to collect the same data. The study is in the Journal of Wildlife Management. The entire kitty cohort included both house cats and feral cats and ranged over almost 6,300 acres. One feral cat's range topped out at 1,351 acres. New York's Central Park covers 843 acres. Owned cats with homes roamed way less than their feral counterparts, but they still averaged a range of just under 5 acres. The pets were highly active just 3% of the time, compared with 14% for the cats that need to find their own food. The work should shed light on protecting species that the cats hunt and inform the efforts to stop the spread of feline contagious diseases.
Sometimes it's not what you eat, but when you eat it, at least when it comes to longevity diets. For some time, scientists have known that animals kept on a strict diet live longer than their well-fed peers. But this Methuselah meal plan is no ordinary just say no to that second slice of pie kind of diet. To reap the life-extending benefits, some of these animals cut their calorie consumption in half. Such a diet might be doable for captive mice and monkeys, but it'd be a tough sell for people. Then, 5 years ago, studies in mice suggested that intermittent fasting would work just as well. These mice abstain from eating every other day and live longer than their gluttonous comrades, without really skimping on the total calories they consumed. Now scientists at Kyoto University have found the same thing in worms that fasted every third day, and they found a gene that regulates the effect, results reported in the journal Nature. Like the mice, these fasting worms did not cut their total calorie intake, but they boosted their lifespan by 50% and showed fewer signs of physical decline than their peers. So go ahead, enjoy that extra slice of pie, because tomorrow's another day to not eat.
We've all heard exercise is good for your physical and mental well-being, but a good workout can actually influence the mental well-being of others, too, because bosses who hit the gym tend to be less abusive to their employees. That's according to a study in the Journal of Business and Psychology. Researchers asked 98 MBA students who were also employed full-time to rate how their supervisors treated them by responding to statements like, "My boss puts me down in front of others." The researchers also had supervisors fill out a different survey about their stress levels and weekly exercise. And as the authors expected, the more stressed out supervisors were, the more their employees felt belittled by them. But the employees felt better about bosses who exercised, whether it was yoga, cardio, or weightlifting, and just 1 or 2 days a week did the trick. Exercise didn't simply melt away the stress. Bosses who worked out reported feeling just as much pressure as their sedentary counterparts. Active bosses just spared subordinates the verbal attacks. So next time you feel like telling your boss to take a hike, it might actually be sound advice.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Steve Mirsky. Got a minute? Here's an impassioned plea for gun control. Of nail guns, that is, because accidents involving nail guns have gone through the renovated roof. In 2005, almost 15,000 people were treated in U.S. emergency rooms for nail gun injuries. That's twice the number in 2001 and 3 times the injuries back in 1991, according to data released in the April 13th issue of Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report put out by the CDC. The rising popularity of do-it-yourselfing seems to be behind the unfortunate trend. Most injuries are puncture wounds to the hands, followed by hits to the forearms, legs, and feet. 6% of the wounded wind up being hospitalized. Although better safety instruction would no doubt help, the report's authors suggest a systems approach to the problem. They'd like nail guns to be impossible to fire until the nose was depressed, which would presumably happen only when the gun was flush up against whatever needed nailing. By the way, 96% of the injured were males, which could mean that they're doing most of the work or that women read the instructions.
The early Earth's oceans were home to a lot of interesting chemistry. Now scientists have found that amino acids thought to be present way back when could have been cooked into other compounds vital for life, an idea you should take with a grain of salt. 4 billion years ago, the planet was probably covered by a salty ocean dotted with volcanic islands and short-lived continents. German researchers recently mimicked some of the chemistry taking place along the coasts of the volcanic islands. They created an approximation of primordial seawater. Then they evaporated it to simulate what went on at those volcanic coasts. They baked the residue, creating salt crusts. At those high temperatures, amino acids interacted with metal ions in the salt crusts and were converted into other important biological molecules such as pyrroles, which are part of the structures of chlorophyll in plants and hemoglobin in animals. The scientists presented their findings September 17th at the European Planetary Science Conference in Potsdam. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these novel compounds could have built up along the volcanic coasts, creating materials for the first living cells, which were really worth their salt.
One of the concerns about working with genetically modified crops has been that vegetation growing in agricultural fields might escape out into the world. Now, for the first time in the U.S., researchers report a large population of GM crops beyond the farm. Transgenic canola plants in North Dakota had received genes making them resistant to herbicides, such as the weed killer Roundup. Researchers collected and tested 406 canola plants along thousands of miles of state roads. They found 347 carrying at least one resistance gene. There were also indications that the inserted genes were being passed on to new generations, producing some plants in the wild with multiple transgenes. The findings were presented on August 6th at the annual meeting of the Ecological Society of America in Pittsburgh. The transgenic canola plants are not about to take over the world, but researchers are obviously curious about how these particular plants manage to make it in places like the edges of parking lots rather than pampered fields. Any answers they find will likely affect future biotechnology regulation.
Want to know the route humans took when they first migrated from Africa into Europe? Seems that they might have marked the path. Not like Hansel and Gretel, who consciously left breadcrumbs. Ancient humans ate as they trekked, and they appear to have chucked aside the packaging for some of their slimy sustenance. Snails. Conventional wisdom has been that humans initially traveled from Africa to the Near East, then up around the Mediterranean through Lebanon before heading into Europe some 40 to 50,000 years ago. But recently, some scientists have theorized that humans made it to Europe first and then headed east. Now there's more support for the old view that humans traveled through the Levant on the way to Europe in the form of the shells of edible marine snails. The study is in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Researchers evaluated shells from an archaeological site dated to the Upper Paleolithic in Lebanon. The shells were mostly intact, except the tapered pointy tip had been removed, most likely for easier access to the meat inside. The scientists calculated the age of the shells via a variety of methods, and they found that the snails dated back almost 46,000 years. The earliest evidence of modern human remains in Europe seems to be no more than 45,000 years old. The snail evidence thus adds weight to the hypothesis that ancient people passed through the Levant on their way to Europe, and not at a snail's pace either.
The eastern gray tree frog looks exactly like the closely related Cope's gray tree frog. The big difference between the two species is beneath the surface. The eastern has twice the number of chromosomes, as does the Cope's. Having more sets of chromosomes makes the cells of the eastern frog larger than the cells found in the Cope's, and those bigger cells makes the eastern's song just a little deeper. Now, University of Missouri researcher Carl Gerhardt and his student Mitch Tucker have determined that the slight difference in the calls, here's the eastern again, and here's the Cope's, is how the females know which species males to buddy up with, the ones with the same chromosome number that they have. The work is in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, Biological Sciences. Speciation is often caused by a geographic barrier that keeps populations from mating. But the tree frog situation may be a rare case in which chromosome duplication and its subsequent effects presented a reproductive barrier. As in humans, it comes down to whether he calls.
Flavanol-rich cocoa is beneficial to health. Flavanol-rich cocoa is beneficial to health. Green tea, wild blueberry, and red wine contain antioxidants. Green tea, wild blueberry, and red wine contain antioxidants.
A rainbow occurs during the monsoon. A rainbow occurs during the monsoon. The restaurant business is not affected by automation. The restaurant business is not affected by automation.
The currency of Japan is yen. The currency of Japan is yen.
There are so many stories which were not related to each other. There are so many stories which were not related to each other.
What is the difference between a man with a full attitude and a man with ignorance? What is the difference between a man with a full attitude and a man with ignorance?
How much leveraging on your values to achieve success is right? How much leveraging on your values to achieve success is right?
Three of the students were confused by the key hypothesis. Three of the students were confused by the key hypothesis.
The next session of the economy course has been cancelled. The next session of the economy course has been cancelled. The two variables in the study were very closely correlated. The two variables in the study were very closely correlated.
A recent article shows a number of interesting experiments. A recent article shows a number of interesting experiments.
Information technology has changed the way people study today. Information technology has changed the way people study today.
The key findings seem to contradict our initial hypothesis. The key findings seem to contradict our initial hypothesis.
This has been a major source of confusion for academics. This has been a major source of confusion for academics. All essays must be accompanied by a list of references. All essays must be accompanied by a list of references.
There will be a conference here next summer on using the web for academic research. There will be a conference here next summer on using the web for academic research.
Our research class is divided into two groups. Our research class is divided into two groups. Your agent will collect a commission for each house they sell. Your agent will collect a commission for each house they sell. Climate change is now an acceptable phenomenon among reputable scientists. Climate change is now an acceptable phenomenon among reputable scientists. Everyone must evaluate during the fire drill. Everyone must evaluate during the fire drill.
Career opportunities in this field are quite limited. Career opportunities in this field are quite limited. Most theories are quite similar, but a few critics disagree. Most theories are quite similar, but a few critics disagree.
Control systems in manufacturing develop a high level of accuracy. Control systems in manufacturing develop a high level of accuracy. The city's founders created a set of rules that became law. The city's founders created a set of rules that became law.